It was the line that stopped the room cold. The moderator had barely finished the question about wages and fairness in America when JD Vance leaned forward, his tone dipped in smug disdain. "Bernie Sanders is living in a fantasy," he said, his lips curling into something closer to a sneer than a smile. "He's never worked a real job in his life. He doesn't understand the working class. He just exploits their frustrations for applause." The words landed like a slap. Gasps and murmurs ran through the debate hall. A handful of supporters clapped half-heartedly, but their applause never took off. What lingered instead was a stunned hush, the kind of silence that feels dangerous, as though a line has just been crossed that no one can walk back. On television screens across the country, families stiffened, workers shook their heads, and millions felt the insult like a personal jab. Because this wasn't just about Bernie Sanders. This was about decades of janitors, teachers, nurses, about the very people who scrub floors, care for children, keep cities running, being told yet again that their dignity doesn't count unless someone like JD Vance says it does. His words didn't just aim at Bernie. They aimed at every calloused hand and tired back that dares to demand respect. And then the cameras cut to Bernie. He hadn't moved. He didn't flinch, didn't fire back, didn't even blink faster. His face was calm, his posture steady, almost as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. Vance took the silence as victory. The crowd, however, sensed something different stirring. Bernie's calm wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Something was coming. The room could feel it building like pressure before a storm. And when it broke, the fallout would be unforgettable. But this wasn't just a sparring match. It was a battle for America's soul. To dismiss Bernie Sanders as out of touch was not merely a cheap debate tactic. It was a strike aimed at the very ethic of working people. The idea that their struggles, their sweat, their sacrifices mattered less than the polish of power and privilege. When JD Vance tried to paint Bernie as detached from the working class, he wasn't just insulting one man. He was eroding the dignity of millions who live paycheck to paycheck. This clash mattered because it wasn't abstract policy theory unfolding on stage. It was a vision of America on trial. On one side stood Vance, posturing as a populist, rapping himself in borrowed rhetoric while serving as a mouthpiece for billionaire donors and anti-worker agendas. On the other stood Bernie, a man whose life and politics had been welded together for half a century by one conviction: the right of ordinary people to live and work with respect. Every union member watching that debate knew instinctively what was at stake. Would the powerful once again write off their demands as whining? Or would someone, finally, speak not only with them in mind, but from their perspective, grounded in their daily realities? Bernie's silence in those heated seconds wasn't hesitation. It was the patience of someone who had heard these insults before and who understood exactly what they symbolized. For immigrant families, for factory towns stripped bare by broken promises, for nurses organizing after double shifts, this wasn't entertainment. It was oxygen. It was a chance, maybe fleeting, to see their values represented on the largest stage. If Vance's arrogance were left unchallenged, their dignity would be diminished once more by elites claiming to speak for them. But if Sanders seized the moment, if he could remind the nation that economic justice was not a radical dream, but the unfinished business of American democracy, then what began as a sneer could transform into a rallying cry. And the stakes weren't just rhetorical. Campaigns rise or fall on moments like these. Voters disillusioned by cynicism were watching closely, wondering if anyone still had the courage to name greed for what it was, to stand unbowed where others bent. By the second minute of that silence, anticipation gripped the room. Bernie's composure promised something larger. Every insult aimed at him wasn't merely an attack. It was the lit match flicked toward dry kindling. And when he finally struck back, the blaze would be impossible to ignore. Because make no mistake, what happened next would change everything. JD Vance built a brand on empathy. and then cashed it in for power. That's the bitter truth hiding beneath the carefully curated narrative he sold to the nation. His memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, once touched readers deeply, an emotional portrayal of poverty, hardship, and family struggles in the Rust Belt. The book positioned him as the authentic voice of forgotten America, the kid who scraped his way forward against the odds. For a time, it seemed as though Vance might emerge as a rare truth-teller, someone who could channel childhood pain into policies that uplift others. But the further he climbed, the more glaring the contradictions became. Instead of using his platform to fight for the working class, Vance transformed it into a ladder to climb into the elite circles he once claimed to critique. Backed by billionaire donors, most loudly by Peter Thiel, Vance's campaign shifted from empathy to opportunism. Gone was the nuanced storyteller of Appalachia. In his place stood a calculating politician, fluent in the language of resentment, yet deaf to the voices of the very communities he rose from. On paper, Vance still markets himself as the everyman, the fighter out of Middletown. But his record tells another story. Opposition to organized labor movements, silence on predatory, corporations gutting small towns, and positions that undermine health care and workers' rights. His common man costume is stitched together by consultants while his pockets are lined by the ultra-wealthy, those most responsible for the suffering he once wrote about. The betrayal resonates loudly because it's not abstract. It's the stark image of a man taking the pain of his neighbors and selling it to the highest bidder. And it wasn't only policy. The personal transformation was equally revealing. Once a sharp critic of Donald Trump, Vance publicly condemned the former president's influence and warned of the dangers of demagoguery. Yet, when ambition called, he reversed course entirely, reshaping himself into one of Trump's most loyal defenders. What had changed? Not his hometown, not the struggles of Appalachia, not the wages of factory workers, but Vance's calculation of where power resided. It was another reminder that, to him, authenticity was negotiable, values were expendable, and truth was malleable so long as it advanced his career. To millions watching, this was the heart of the hypocrisy. Vance spoke of loving the working class while pushing policies that weakened their bargaining power. He spoke of honoring families while supporting agendas that stripped away social supports. He sold himself as living proof that hard work could conquer adversity. While ignoring that without systemic change, most people in his hometown could never replicate his path. He became the symbol of a story hijacked, of empathy commodified. And that's why his confrontation with Bernie Sanders carried such weight. Bernie, who for over 4 decades had spoken the same message about working families, now stood across from a man who wore a stolen version of that message like a cloak. Except cloaks can't hide everything. The seams are visible if you know where to look. The billionaire backers, the betrayals of principle, the policies tailored to corporate America and not struggling communities. At the debate, when Vance mocked Bernie as never having worked a real job, it reverberated with hypocrisy so thick it was almost unbearable. Here was a man who had made millions selling a tale of hardship, now standing as the mouthpiece of those who profit from hardship. For an audience who had lived the realities he twisted, it was salt in the wound. The stage was primed, the contrast set. Arrogance cloaked in false empathy faced conviction rooted in consistency. And while Vance believed his smirk and sharp barbs would secure a win, what he didn't realize was that his own contradictions had already built the scaffolding of his downfall. All Bernie had to do was light the match, and the mask would burn. All the way. While others shifted with the wind, Bernie stood in the storm. That was the defining rhythm of his life, steady, unflinching, unbent by the tides of political fashion. To understand the force he carried into the debate with JD Vance, you have to trace his story back to the streets of Brooklyn, where resilience wasn't a slogan, it was survival. Born in 1941 to Jewish immigrant parents, Bernie's earliest lessons were not found in textbooks, but in the texture of lived struggle. His father, Eli, emigrated from Poland with little money and a thick accent, working long hours as a paint salesman. Their family lived in a rent-controlled apartment, one paycheck always close to collapse. For Bernie, fairness wasn't theoretical. It was the unspoken question of whether his family could make rent, whether the cream on the table during the holidays was a luxury they couldn't afford. He grew up watching his parents' sacrifices clash with the system designed to favor those who already had. That tension planted a lifelong conviction that dignity should not be rationed by birth or wealth. He understood, even as a boy, the quiet unfairness stretching across America, the gap between those who had everything and those who labored endlessly for fragments. In his youth, at Brooklyn's James Madison High School, Bernie wasn't the loudest or the flashiest. But he was the kid asking tough questions, the one unwilling to accept that poverty was simply a fact of life. He saw excess on one side of the city, struggle on the other, and asked why. That why became the tether that pulled him into activism at the University of Chicago in the early 1960s. There, Bernie threw himself into the civil rights movement, challenging segregation head-on. He marched with the Congress of Racial Equality, was arrested protesting segregated housing, and joined sit-ins until administrators had no choice but to reckon with youthful defiance. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing justice. While other ambitious students memorized talking points for future campaigns, Bernie was dragging mattresses into university buildings so black students forced into inferior housing had a place to sleep. Justice wasn't a rhetorical device for him. It was an everyday practice carved out through resistance. This spirit carried into every arena he stepped into afterward. Moving to Vermont in his early adulthood, he embedded himself among farmers, carpenters, working families. He saw in their everyday lives the mirrored realities of his Brooklyn upbringing, disproportionate burdens borne by those least equipped to carry them. Bernie became mayor of Burlington in 1981, shocking the establishment by ousting entrenched power with grassroots organizing. Even then, his politics looked radical to elites but felt familiar to working families. Housing, education, wages, fairness. His voice didn't emerge from theories in think tanks. It emerged from conversations in town halls and factory break rooms. Over decades in Congress and later the Senate, Bernie never abandoned that through line. While others trimmed their principles to fit donor approval or rising polls, Bernie's message was identical in rhythm, decade after decade. Billionaires have too much power. Workers deserve dignity. Health care is a right, not a privilege. Critics mocked him for monotony. Supporters saw it as proof. While politics became a game of rebranding for opportunists like JD Vance, Bernie had no need to reinvent himself. The story had been consistent all along. That consistency is why the insult Vance leveled was so grating and so false. Bernie had, in fact, worked a real job. Organizing movements, challenging segregation, pushing legislation to increase wages and protect pensions. More than that, he had spent his life working for other people's jobs, to protect them, to secure their dignity. For the janitors earning minimum wage, the steelworkers fighting outsourcing, the nurses stretched to exhaustion, Bernie's work was unmistakably real because it was for them. And here lay the preparation for the clash. Bernie had encountered men like Vance before, men who mistook clever rhetoric for authenticity, men who adorned themselves in the language of class struggle while working to hollow it from within. His decades in activism and politics had conditioned him, steeled him, for the sneer Vance unleashed. He had stood at rallies facing crowds less friendly, sat in chambers facing powerful adversaries who dismissed him, and walked in marches where police dragged him off. A smirk on a debate stage. That was nothing new. Yet what made him formidable wasn't anger. It was his calm. His entire life, Bernie had practiced the art of standing steady against arrogance. From his father's immigrant struggles to his civil rights protests, from Vermont's grassroots to Capitol Hill, he had built a political identity rooted not in opportunism, but in constancy. And so, on that stage, with J.D. Vance trying to weaponize smugness against sincerity, Bernie didn't just represent himself, he represented every thread of his life's work. And it was precisely that lifetime of struggle and conviction that made him uniquely prepared to answer back, not with bluster, but with a truth so sharp and undeniable that it wouldn't just silence Vance, it would ignite the country watching. Each smirk from Vance only set him up for what was coming. By this point in the debate, the crowd had already felt the tension spiraling upward. J.D. Vance, emboldened by the sound of his own voice, leaned hard into the lines his team had carefully crafted. Bernie was too old, too extreme, too out of touch to understand the modern working class. His words dripped with both condescension and calculation, each barb delivered like a dart he was certain would land. But the crowd's reaction wasn't what he expected. Instead of laughter or thunderous cheers, there was an unease creeping through the room. The smirks from Vance looked less like strength and more like cheap showmanship, more like a bully circling a target than a leader laying out vision. A handful of claps echoed weakly, but the applause never took root. What grew instead was a murmuring restlessness, audience members shifting in their seats, heads tilting, eyes narrowing. Something about the mismatch between the man claiming to represent workers and the man mocking the one politician who had spent decades defending them rang hollow. Bernie said nothing. He wasn't rattled by Vance's taunts about age, nor was he bothered by the smears about being stuck in the past. He let them pile on, brick after brick, until they became a shaky tower standing unsteadily under its own weight. His eyes remained fixed, not on his opponent but on the moderator, and, at times, directly into the camera, sending a subtle message to the millions at home. I hear you. I'm here for you. I don't need to shout to prove it. The contrast was stark. Vance, gesturing wildly, his voice rising with each insult, looked desperate to provoke a reaction, mistaking contempt for dominance. Bernie, hands resting calmly on his podium, looked immovable, as if he were a mountain weathering a storm. Every time Vance cut in, Bernie simply waited, adding gravity to the silence, allowing his opponent's performance to echo back upon itself. The audience saw it. They read the nervous twitch in Vance's movements, the forced confidence in his laugh, the way he kept glancing back and forth as if scanning for approval that wasn't coming. Meanwhile, the calmness in Bernie carried the weight of authenticity. For decades he had been underestimated, dismissed, shouted down, sneered at, and every time he let his persistence, not his temper, be his counterpunch. By now, the dynamic had shifted entirely. The longer Bernie stayed unshaken, the more transparently unhinged Vance appeared. The insults began to feel repetitive, hollow echoes of talking points crafted to strike, but failing to land. The crowd leaned forward not because they believed Vance was winning, but because they knew Bernie was simply waiting, letting the tension build to the inevitable breaking point. Every insult was a digging motion, and still he dug, deeper, faster, unaware. And Bernie let him, because what no one else in the room seemed to recognize just yet was that the silence wasn't avoidance. It was restraint. It was preparation. And when that preparation ended, when Bernie finally chose to speak, the release of that built-up energy would be so fierce that Vance's words would crumble under its weight. The room could already feel it hovering just out of reach, the anticipation before a storm's first crack of thunder. And J.D. Vance, still circling his prey with cheap laughter and hollowed-out bravado, had no idea he was building the stage for his own undoing. And then, with one line, Bernie Sanders turned the room upside down. J.D. Vance had just delivered another sneering jab, an attempt to frame Bernie as a relic of the past, clinging to 1960s slogans while the world has moved on. He let the insult hang dramatically, flashing that self-satisfied grin that said he believed he'd punctured Bernie for good. The room buzzed, but not in his favor. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing Sanders' composure was about to transform into fire. Bernie looked directly at Vance, then out into the hall, his Brooklyn-inflected voice low, deliberate, pointed. He didn't need theatrics. His words carried the weight of a lifetime. "Mr. Vance," he began, pausing just long enough to freeze the air, "you like to talk about the working class because you wrote a best-selling book about it. I've spent my entire life fighting for working people, not writing their pain, not selling their story, not cashing it in for billionaire donors. That may be the difference between us." The reaction was instant. Gasps first, then cheers, swelling like a wave crashing the shoreline. Vance's grin faltered, his eyes darting. Bernie had only just opened the door, but already the audience knew what was happening. The tables had turned. Sanders pressed forward. His voice didn't rise in anger. It sharpened with clarity. "You say I don't understand the working class? My father sold paint. My family lived paycheck to paycheck. I saw hunger. I saw struggle. I've seen families in this country work 2 or 3 jobs while their employers get tax breaks and their kids can't afford medicine. That is real life. It is not a slogan. It is not a memoir. It is reality. And the tragedy is, Governor Vance, you know this reality. You lived it. But instead of fighting against it, you stand here defending the very billionaires and corporations who profit from it." The audience erupted again, this time with a louder, longer ovation. People rose to their feet. Cameras caught faces lit with excitement, disbelief, vindication. The clip was already being tweeted, clipped, replayed before Bernie even took his next breath. Vance attempted to interject, raising his voice to claw back the moment. But Bernie's timing was flawless. He rolled straight into the contradiction at the very heart of Vance's persona. "Your book," he continued, commanding the stage, "spoke of families crushed under poverty, of children denied opportunity. You sold millions of copies. You gave speeches. You convinced America you cared. But when the time came to stand up and fight for those same people, you ran into the arms of billionaires. You embraced the corruption you once condemned, and you built a career attacking the very programs that might have helped the next kid from Middletown climb out of poverty." The hall shook with applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was organismal, rhythmic, thunderous. Protest chants rolled through the crowd. "Bernie, Bernie." The moderators tried to quiet the audience but failed. Bernie had hit the artery, cut to the bone of hypocrisy in a way that no rebuttal could repair. Vance's mouth moved, but nothing he said could pierce through the tidal roar. Bernie wasn't finished. He leaned into the microphone, his words now directed past his opponent, past the moderator, out into millions of homes. "I may be old, Mr. Vance, but let me tell you something about age. In 40 years of public life, I have said the same thing. We must take on the greed of Wall Street, the corruption of Washington, and the power of billionaire donors strangling our democracy. And do you know what? I stand here tonight saying the exact same thing. Consistency is not weakness. Consistency is standing with working people whether it is popular or not. You, on the other hand, change your mask every time power changes its shape. It was devastating. Decades once mocked as a liability, turned in an instant into evidence of integrity and endurance. Bernie had not just neutralized Vance's attack, he reversed it, turning age into credibility, turning longevity into moral evidence of his unwavering stance. Vance's shoulders stiffened as he tried to smirk, but under the heat of the lights and the louder-than-ever ovations, his discomfort was obvious. The smirk looked brittle, painted on. Sweat traced down his temple. He shuffled papers that didn't matter. The camera zoomed close, capturing the face of a man who realized he'd lost control of the narrative. Bernie's final line detonated like a closing gavel. You can sneer. You can mock. You can cash the checks of billionaires. But don't you ever question whether I've worked for the people of this country. because unlike you, I never abandoned them." The hall exploded. Standing ovation. Roars that reverberated off the walls. It wasn't just applause, it was catharsis, the release of years of frustration as truth finally shredded through pretense. People were on their feet, fists pumping, chants echoing. Commentators backstage exchanged glances, already preparing headlines. Sanders crushes Vance with mic drop moment. And as Bernie coolly stepped back from the mic, hands folded, expression calm, the contrast was undeniable. One man shrank. The other had expanded to fill the room. Bernie Sanders didn't just counter JD Vance, he dismantled him, word by word, contradiction by contradiction. And in the wreckage of that takedown, a new story emerged. That authenticity, when delivered with conviction, can still light the fire of a nation. The debate could continue, but the night would forever belong to that moment. The moment JD Vance walked into his own trap, and Bernie Sanders walked out carrying the crowd, the story, and the moral high ground. The clip spread like wildfire within minutes. Before the moderators even moved to the next topic, the takedown was already buzzing. Across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, one 15-second cut, Bernie leveling JD Vance with, "Don't you ever question whether I've worked for the people of this country. Unlike you, I never abandoned them," hit 1 million views on X before midnight. By dawn, it was everywhere, hashtags, roared into trending territory. Yika Bernie shuts down Vance, never abandons, and simply hawk mic drop. Memes followed instantly. One popular loop showed Vance trying to speak as a tidal wave of applause drowned him out, overlaid with the caption, "When the truth is louder than your billionaires." Another cut between Bernie's words and clips of steelworkers cheering, nurses clapping, and teachers nodding in solidarity. The internet had turned his counterattack into cultural shorthand. Cable networks scrambled to catch up. CNN's panel called it the defining exchange of the campaign. MSNBC anchors replayed the clip 3 times in 10 minutes, voices brimming with astonishment. This wasn't policy detail, this was moral authority. Even a few usually conservative outlets admitted Vance had looked rattled. The New York Times splashed a midnight headline, "Sanders seizes debate spotlight with towering rebuttal." But the real shockwaves weren't confined to media. In Union, halls and restaurants, in group chats and late-night Zoom calls, the conversation crackled with energy. A welder in Ohio texted his friend, "Finally, someone called him out." A teacher in Michigan tweeted, "This is the Bernie that makes us believe change is possible." Immigrant families watching from Brooklyn to Los Angeles shared the clip with their kids, showing them an example of dignity standing tall against dismissal. For many, the moment wasn't politics. It was personal validation. Grassroots organizers seized it immediately. Within 24 hours, the Sanders campaign reported surges of small-dollar donations. Volunteer sign-ups spiked as supporters flooded websites, eager to channel applause into momentum. Videos of ordinary people recording their emotional reactions on TikTok, some tearing up as they replayed Bernie's words, circulated as if they too were part of the story. Meanwhile, conservative strategists scrambled. On Fox News, pundits insisted it was more performance than substance, but the shakiness of their tone suggested panic. GOP operatives admitted Vance lost that moment completely, and whispers rose about whether their champion had been exposed as more actor than advocate. Vance's attempt at recovery interviews fell flat. His counterspin was drowned by the sheer volume of shares, jokes, and commentary mocking his stunned silence versus Bernie's thunderous clarity. The ripple spread beyond campaign circles. Teachers referenced Bernie's line about never abandoning working people in classrooms, sparking debates about authenticity in leadership. Podcasters dissected the exchange as a masterclass in moral storytelling. Even in workplaces, the next morning, from coffee shops to factory floors, conversations started with, "Did you see Bernie last night?" Some moments in politics vanish with the news cycle. Others crystallize, becoming more than analysis points. They become symbols. Bernie's mic drop was one of those. It stitched together personal histories across the country. Families climbing. From poverty, workers exhausted but proud. Students demanding a future. They saw themselves reflected in that rebuke, in that unwavering voice that cut past smugness to reveal simple truth, that loyalty to the working class is measured in decades, not just in words, and certainly not in books cashed in for credibility. The end of that week, pollsters tagged the debate as a turning point. The Sanders camp had new wind, while Vance carried the blemish of being undone not by rage, but by calm conviction. The story had left the debate stage. It was now in living rooms, hearts, and headlines. The shockwaves proved undeniable. One line, spoken with clarity, had shaken the carefully curated mask of a rival, reignited faith among the disillusioned, and reminded America why authenticity matters. And the question burning now, could that momentum be sustained into the campaign battlegrounds ahead? The suspense only amplified the moment's power. The nation, still buzzing, braced for the next chapter. This wasn't about me. It was about us. That's how Bernie Sanders chose to close the evening, tearing the moment from the grip of personal victory and handing it back to the crowd, to the millions watching at home, to the people whose lives had shaped his cause. With those words, he ensured that the debate would not just be remembered as a clash of personalities, but as an affirmation of values, dignity, fairness, inclusion, that transcend any single election. He looked into the camera, not as a gladiator, basking in triumph, but as a messenger delivering a reminder that the American story is not defined by billionaires, nor by sneers and insults, but by the work of ordinary people who make the country run. The strength of America is not found in corporate boardrooms, he declared, his voice rising, but in the people who teach our kids, who care for the sick, who build our homes, who drive our trucks, who harvest our food. Strength is the or dignity of labor, and it's long past time this country recognized that. The audience listened with rapt attention, the electricity of the earlier eruption shifting into something deeper, something reflective. Bernie wasn't just dismantling JD Vance anymore, he was reframing the night as a moral parable. His point was unmistakable. Arrogance fades, bluster dissolves, but consistency and truth endure. He invoked not only workers, but the millions, of families who for decades have been told they don't belong, immigrants scraping for opportunity, communities of color locked out of prosperity, youth staring at shrinking futures. Justice cannot be selective, Bernie said firmly. It cannot belong to some and not to others. We rise together or we fall divided. The America we fight for is big enough to hold us all. The hall erupted in applause, but the mood was different from the roaring outbursts earlier in the evening. This was the surge of hope, the deep-down recognition that moments like these aren't about theater. They are about glimpsing the country we still might imagine, the country that could be. And in that reframing lay the resolution. Vance's insults and smirks would fade into footnotes of cynicism. Bernie's message, tied directly to the universal human desires for dignity, belonging, and fairness, would last far longer. The lesson crystallized plainly. Arrogance may dominate a headline for a night, but solidarity endures across generations. This is not just about defeating one candidate, he said in his final breath of the segment. It's about defeating the idea that greed is inevitable, that division is permanent, and that hope is naive. Hope has built movements before, and it will build them again. The applause rose once more, not just in the debate hall, but in living rooms across America, because people understood the victory they witnessed wasn't Bernie's alone, it was theirs. It was proof that truth, spoken with sincerity, can still outshine the loudest arrogance. One debate, one comeback, one reminder of what America stands for. That's what we just witnessed when Bernie Sanders shut down JD Vance with devastating clarity, turning arrogance into rubble and elevating the dignity of working people into the spotlight, where it belongs. The video title told you the story. Bernie Sanders shuts down JD Vance with jaw-dropping comeback. But living through it, seeing the eruption of the crowd, the stunned silence of a hollow attack exposed, and the tidal wave on social media that followed, it was more than a comeback. It was a reaffirmation of what America can be when truth faces down pretense. Bernie's words landed not because they were clever, but because they were consistent. For decades, he's carried the same message. Workers matter, justice matters, fairness matters, and when tested on a stage against someone who cashed in authenticity for power, the truth broke through. That moment didn't just belong to Bernie, it belonged to everyone who's ever been written off, dismissed, or mocked simply for demanding dignity. Now, the question isn't whether his comeback was unforgettable. It's what we do with it. This clip can fade like so many headlines, or it can fuel a movement of people who know the stakes, who feel the urgency, who believe America must rise on solidarity rather than sink on cynicism. If you believe in that vision, don't just watch. Act. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Keep spreading the word. Together, we amplify the truth. Together, we remind the powerful. America does not belong to bullies. America belongs to the people. All of the people.